So we're going to begin this evening with, Tony's going to give us an introduction first and introduce us to the show. Back to you.
So COVID changed everything for me in that prior to the pandemic, I never really shared our backstory with anybody. Frankly, most people couldn't cope with it. It was just too much. But also, I suppose that we didn't really wish to be defined by it. But post COVID-19, with so many people experiencing so much sort of connection with trauma, suddenly our story didn't feel that extraordinary anymore. And I think that that's what maybe took me back to the journals that I'd kept since paralyzing accident. And rereading them, what I realized, if I hadn't already known it, was that central to the way that I coped with what had happened was drawing. Absolutely being with the unfolding events somehow felt more possible as a result of the drawings that I was making. I mean, I'm an artist, that's what I do. It shouldn't be that much of a surprise, but that, in a sense, was the catalyst for this research project. So empirically, I knew that drawing had been, I think, fairly instrumental in allowing me to process what had been happening. But this research year, in a sense, was trying to work out why. So I think observational drawing can be really quite powerful stuff. Let me maybe give you some examples of that. So recently I finished up teaching a course and a student came to me at the end and she said, "You know, Tony, when I draw with you on Friday afternoons, it's the only time I don't think about him being her recently deceased husband." And frankly, that kind of feedback is not that unusual. And I've had drawing exercises that I've carried out with people being retooled to diminish the impact of like a full-blown panic attack. For me personally, I can tell you that in the very early stages of my partner's recovery, the only time I didn't think about it and the really troubling implications of what had happened was when I was here teaching people to draw. So the thing I should say about the drawings that I'm describing in this context is, well, I'm not talking about making art. These are drawings that are completely unrelated to the idea of capturing a feeling or communicating a narrative. These are drawings that are made very much in relation to trying to respond to, trying to maybe capture something of the experience of seeing. So in that respect, you can say that they are a kind of perceptual thinking, because what they're actually about is trying to understand, make sense of sense data and how it is shaped. So in a sense, how the visual world is perceived. And what I found really interesting about that one, interesting and life-saving, I guess, when I was in the depths of the difficulties that we as a family found ourselves in, what I found really interesting about that was that by making these drawings, they kind of called into question the visual reality in front of me, so that things felt more ambiguous, things felt less absolute. And what that seemed to do was to maybe open up a space of what you might call, safe uncertainty. It was like where rigid thoughts or rigid responses could be gently questioned. How? Well, seeing is thinking. So 1/3 of your brain is taken up processing visual data into something that you recognize, something that you might make sense of, you might understand. Excuse me. And well, the experience of engaging with that can be really quite sort of limiting insofar as you tend to see what you've seen before. You tend to find that past experience is really what governs how you make sense of the world. But look, when you make drawings, when you make observational drawings, there is possibility of entertaining maybe several different ways of directing the gaze concurrently. So, if you like, in my sort of everyday looking, my response to the visual world tends to be sequential. I gradually work towards maybe a definitive understanding of what it is that I am seeing. But when I make drawings, I can entertain multiple visual identities within my field of vision. And what that means is that, if you like, I'm thinking in parallel. It's not forward propulsive. I'm looking at lots and lots of different things at the same time. And now, for me, that was really important, because when things were particularly dire, when things felt really, really overwhelming, I'd be making these drawings, and that aspect of drawing seemed to maybe model a better way to respond to our situation. So what I found myself doing was maybe layering information so that the sort of net result of all those things felt less concrete, felt less troubling. Excuse me. So another thing that I think was quite significant about the drawings that I was making at the time is that they maybe brought me to a place where I became more conscious of my physical self. And that was, I think, really important as the months progressed, I beg your pardon, because actually I felt increasingly numbed, I felt increasingly disassociated. So responding to, reflecting on the engagements I was having in the world, they were very much from a sort of disembodied third person point of view. Everything was kind of once removed. But the thing about drawing is that it makes seeing become more bodily. You become much more conscious of what your gaze is doing, because the movement of your eyes is reciprocated by the movement of your hand as you trace that. So there's a kind of union between sight and touch. And given that seeing is your primary sense, and you're doing that all the time, that was quite significant. And I guess the other thing that drawing did for me in the, once I'm 6 months to a year in, is that it had a really calming effect, because when you draw, it has the potential to regulate your breathing. And if you're breathing more slowly and you're breathing more deeply, that down-regulates your heartbeat, which, so your heart slows down. And that manifests itself as a feeling of calm. So it felt like drawing also had the facility to offer this sort of centering aspect too. So those things, you might say, operate below the level of language, below the level of conscious thought. But drawing also, for me, had the potential to destabilize language itself. So as I was observing the world and tracing onto paper a record of what my eyes were doing, the systematic code of language itself started to be unsettled, and that led, I think, to changes psychologically in the way that I was responding. Things felt less absolute. Things were harder to pin down. The negative thoughts that I had been having, they didn't disappear, but they didn't repeat themselves in quite the same way. So I think that what drawing does to language is really interesting, I think. Insofar as, the first thing you learn to do with language is to name. And the thing about the way that we engage the world generally, visually, is we name. That's how we make sense of our world. But when you make observational drawings, actually your focus is on the structure of the image that you're engaging, rather than its content or its meaning. And when we make drawings from observation, it's not a drawing of the thing that's observed, it's a drawing that says something about the experience of observing. So I think it's fair to say that drawings stand once removed for the things that we're looking at. Drawings are not about an absolute kind of depiction of what's there. There's something metaphorical about drawings. And that brings me on finally to Monika's film, because I think for me, it operates in a similar way. So she touches tangentially on our backstory, but in a way that for me resonates, I think, with poetry, insofar as you think about, a line of poetry, and you take individual words and you network them together, and often it's the case that it doesn't wholly make sense. You can't quite hold it, but the way that it sounds and the way that those words in sequence feel in your mouth as you sound them, that clearly is, there's something real, there's something, quite definite about what's going on there, but it's less distinct. So I find Monika's film really moving, and I think that maybe it's something to do with the fact that, for me, it offers maybe a different truth in relation to the events that unfolded in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. There's so much in that, and I know there's such a lot in your podcast and in the exhibition itself. Yeah, it's just incredible. You started with your thank yous, and it's just really striking to think about. We often think about art as perhaps a solitary practice. It just reminds us the amount of community and sharing that takes place there. I might come back to that with questions later, but I wondered if we hand over to Monika, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about your involvement with the project and your experience in making the film in response to Tony's research and work.
And kind of pulling it back to the work on the film itself, I correct me, Tony, if I'm wrong, but I think that you wanted to work with me because you know my practice. You are aware of the methods that I work with, of my process. I'm very much interested in the notion of loss, and I've explored this subject for over 10 years now. So in some way it kind of feels like I'm a natural fit to handle this subject matter. And what I found was that obviously subject matter is quite close to what I work with, but what was difficult was to find the balance between when I work obviously and dealing with certain difficult subject, I mainly work with my own emotions. In here, I had to navigate the space when I had to be very sensitive to the background story, and I had to be very sensitive to emotions of others. And I think that that was quite difficult. And I had to navigate that space. In terms of what I generally do when I go and film, I'm finding the locations and finding the images that I actually want to work with. I work in a quite meditative way, which I feel that later is kind of reflected in my work. But what happened here was that I was really interested in the subject matter per se, and what actually happens when you recover, or you are in the process of recovery from traumatic event. So I was actually trying to imagine the state of kind of like an interstate in between stasis, between being in a place where everything is closed down, a kind of claustrophobic place, and on the other hand, in the place when everything is opening up. But I believe that actually what happens is that whether you are outside, it not necessarily means that you are free and there's no claustrophobia there anymore, because you kind of carry certain emotions through. This is your process. So when you see in the movie that there are kind of on the left side of the screen, we kind of dealing with entrapment, with interior, with kind of closed spaces, and on the right side of the screen, we kind of seeing outside. But interestingly enough, it's not always they can be read in a such straightforward way, because even if we see outside, let's take the example of the image showing the rainy landscape with the leaves. Actually, it's very claustrophobic because you can't see through it. Similar things happen with the other image when, which interestingly enough is a meditative space in Portugal, in a monastery, where also you have actually a big rock that obstructs the view. So although we are outside, there is that interspace when you're kind of still dealing with those emotions of being entrapment. But eventually, obviously, there is some hope, that there is some change when you're actually opening up, and there are actually imagery that kind of in some way show the really open free space when you can finally engage with and open up. But what I'm really interested in, and Tony actually talks about drawing, about the language. Kind of traditionally, cinema is associated with language of prose or narrative prose. What I'm interested in is because I believe that fundamentally cinema is actually associated, or should be associated, with the language of poetry, and that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the oniric nature of cinema. So the dreamlike reality, fragments, and that's what I work with. I work with fragments because what I actually believe is that's what happens in the recovery process. You have to reconfigure yourself from those fragments of memory, from those fragments of dreams, and also through the question of who I was and who is me. And I think that this is kind of the core here. And whether people might feel like that's very metaphorical, everything in the movie is very metaphorical, but that's exactly my point, that you can't really close it, entrap it, because that process should be your engagement with the movie, and also the process of recovery is very personal, and you have your own journey. That journey will be different for everyone because you bring your own emotions, you bring your own experience. And the same with the reception of the film. I'm inviting people to enter the journey with their own emotions, to come in that space, and hopefully it will take them on some journey. And I'm also trying to work with the notion of time, temporality, for the reason that I'm also interested in the aspect of it, kind of interested in the notion of looking and seeing. Similarly, like Tony was talking about. So when you slow down, because you almost have no option, because there's not much happening in the movie, in those vistas that I kind of join together, you have no choice just to also slow down, and it's almost exercise with the patients, but it's also exercise in inviting you to see beyond the image. So what you see, yes, someone would say, okay, it's a representation of the place, but actually it will represent something else for everyone else in some way, because you bring in your own emotions, your own experience into it. And it's very open, because the same way like your journey with recovery is very open, and you have to assemble from the fragments, and you have to make sense out of it on your own terms. And the last thing I'm going to say is that obviously the movie was made in different locations, but one of the locations in the last shot is the shot of actually ruins of hospital, which I think it also kind of adds extra dimension to it. The ruins of the hospital. You kind of, when you, the kind of stage of the recovery, when you actually setting yourself free, when you actually have the possibility of moving forward, you still actually carry with yourself the scars of what happened. And you have to kind of navigate that space whatever way you can. So it's not that the final image is there, oh wow, we are already there. No, it's a constant struggle, but it's already there that we kind of out of this stasis, we're out of the feeling that we can't move forward. So we are already moving forward, but still with the baggage. And I think that's very important. And we're going to carry it till the end.
I think it's a really, really important point. Thank you both for giving a little insight into your thinking and the process and the work that's gone into the exhibition.